Hello everybody, and welcome to me reading you the fourth book in the Alex Rider set. And I'm just starting this book, so it's lovely for me. I haven't even known anything about this book. Not even a single word. Actually, I do know a few words about this book, but yeah. So this book I'll be reading you is called Eagle Strike. I feel like it might be about the eagle doing striking. Let's just read out and find out. The Alex Rider series. The first book is Stormbreaker. Second book is going to be Point Blanc. Third book will be Skeleton Key. Fourth book, which is this book, Eagle Strike. Fourth book, fifth book, Scorpio, which is right next to me. Sixth book, Archangel. Seventh book, Snakehead. Eighth book, Crocodile Tears. Ninth book, Scorpio Rising. 10th book, Russian Roulette. Right, let's start reading this lovely book. Let's find chapter 1. Chapter 1. Not my business. Alex Rider lay on his back, drying out in the midday sun. He could feel the salt water from his last swim trickling through his hair and evaporating off his chest. His shorts, still wet, clung to him. He was at that moment as happy as it is possible to be. 1 week in a holiday that had been perfect from the moment the plane had touched down in Montpellier, and he had stepped out into the brilliance of his first Mediterranean day. He loved the south of France, the intense colours, the smells, the pace of life that hung onto every minute and refused to let go. He hadn't any idea what time it was, except that he was getting hungry and guessed it must soon be lunch. There was a whisper of percussion as a girl walked past him wearing a bright pink skull candy headphones with a wire trailing into her backpack. Alex turned his head to follow her, and that was when the sun went in. The sea froze and the whole world seemed to catch its breath. He wasn't looking at the girl with the headphones. He was looking past her down to the sea wall that divided the beach from the jetty where a yacht was pulling in. The yacht was enormous, almost the size of one of the passengers' boats that carried tourists up and down the coast. But no tourists would ever set foot on this craft. It was completely uninviting, cruising silent through the water, with tinted glass in the windows and a massive bow that rose up like a solid white wall. A man stood at the very front, staring straight ahead, his face blank. It was a face that Alex recognized instantly. Yasin Gregorowitz. It had to be. Alex sat perfectly still, supporting himself on one arm, his hand half buried in the sand. As he watched, a man in his 20s appeared from the cabin and busied himself mooring the boat. He was short and ape-like, wearing a string vest that showed off the tattoos which completely covered his arms and shoulders. A deckhand? Yasin made no offer to help with his work. A third man hurried along the jetty. He was fat and bold, dressed in a cheap white suit. The top of his head had been burnt by the sun, and the skin had turned an ugly, cancerous red. Yasin saw him and climbed down, moving like spilt oil. He was wearing blue jeans and a white shirt open at the neck. Other men might have struggled to keep their balance walking down the swaying gangplank, but he didn't even hesitate. There was something inhuman about him. With his close-cropped hair, his hard blue eyes and pale, expressionless face. He was obviously no holiday maker, but only Alex knew the truth about him. Yasen Gregorovich was a contract killer. The man who had murdered his uncle and changed his own life. He was wanted all over the world. So what was he doing here in the little seaside town on the edge of the marshes and lagoons that made up the Camargue? There was nothing insane Perry apart from beach sites, campsites, too many restaurants, and an oversized church that looked more like a fortress. It had taken Alex a week to get used to the quiet charm of the place. And now this. Alex, what are you looking at? Sabina murmured. Alex had to force himself to turn round to remember that she was there. The words wouldn't come. He didn't know what to say. Do you think you could rub a little more sun cream into my back? I'm overheating. That was Sabina. Slim dark hair and sometimes much older than her, 15 years. But then she was a sort of girl who had probably swapped toys for boys before she hit 11. Although she was using factor 25, she seemed to need more sun cream rubbed every 15 minutes, and somehow it was always Alex who had to do it for her. He glanced quickly at her back, which was in fact perfectly bronzed. She was wearing a bikini made out of so little material that it hadn't bothered with a pattern. Her eyes were covered with a pair of Dior sunglasses, which she had bought for a tenth of the price of the real thing. And she had her head buried in the Lord of the Rings, at the same time waving the sun cream. Alex looked back at the yacht. Yasen was shaking hands with the bold man. The deckhand was standing nearby, waiting. Even at this distance, Alex could see that Yasen was very much in charge. That when he spoke, the two men listened. Alex had once seen Yasen shoot a man dead from a farm just for dropping a package. There was still an extraordinary coldness about him that seemed to neutralize even the Mediterranean sun. The strange thing was that there were very few people in the world who would have been able to recognize the Russian. Alex was one of them. Could Yasen's being here have something to do with him? Alex, Sabine said. The three men moved away from the boat, heading into the town. Suddenly Alex was on his feet. I'll be right back here, he said. Where are you going? I need a drink. I've got water. No, I want Coke. Even as he swept up his t-shirt and pulled it over his head, Alex knew that this was not a good idea. Yasen might have come to the Camargue because he wanted a holiday. He might have come to murder the local mayor. Either way, it had nothing to do with Alex, and it would be crazy to get involved with Yasen again. Alex remembered the promise he had made the last time they had met on rooftop in central London. You killed Iron Rider, one day I'll kill you. At the time he had meant it, but that had been then. Right now he didn't want anything to do with Yasen or the world he represented. And yet, Yasen was here. He had to know why. The three men were walking along the main road, following the line of sea. Alex doubled back across the sand, passing the wide concrete building that had struck him as a bazaar. When he'd first come here, until he had remembered that he was only about 100 miles from Spain. There was to be a bullfight tonight. People were already queuing at the tiny windows to buy a ticket, but he and Sabina had decided they would keep well clear. I hope the bull wins, had been Sabina's only comment. Yasen and the two men turned left, disappearing into the town centre. Alex quickened his pace, knowing how easy it would be to lose them in the tangle of lanes and alleyways that surrounded the church. He didn't have to be too careful about being seen. Yasen thought he was safe. It was unlikely that, in a crowded holiday resort, he would notice anyone following him, but with Yasen, you never knew. Alex felt his heart thumping with every step he took. His mouth was dry, and for once, it wasn't the sun that was to blame. Yasen had gone. Alex looked left and right. There were people crowding in on him from all sides, pouring out of the shops and into the open-air restaurants that were already serving lunch. The smell of paella filled the air. He cursed himself for hanging back, for not daring to get any closer. The three men could have disappeared inside any of the buildings. Could it be that he had imagined seeing them in the first place? It was a pleasant thought, but it was a dashed moment later when he caught sight of them sitting on a terrace in front of a smart restaurant in the square. The bold man was already calling for menus. Alice walked in front of a shop selling postcards, using the racks as a screen between himself and the restaurant. Next came a cafe, serving snacks and drinks beneath wide, multicoloured umbrellas. He edged into it. Yasen and the other two men were now less than 10 meters away, and Alice could make out more details. The deckhand was pushing bread into his mouth, as if he hadn't eaten for a week. The bold man was talking quietly, urgently, waving his fist in the air to emphasize the point. Yasen was listening patiently, with the noise of the crowd all around, and it couldn't make out a word any of them were saying. He peered round one of the umbrellas, and a waiter almost collided with him, letting loose a torrent of angry French. Yasen glanced in his direction and then ducked away, afraid that he had drawn attention to himself. A line of plants in wooden tubs divided the cafe from the restaurant terrace where the men were eating. Alex slipped between two of the tubs and moved quickly into the shadows of the restaurant interior. He felt safer here, less exposed. The kitchens were right behind him. To one side was a bar, and in front of it about a dozen tables, all of them empty. Waiters were coming in and out with plates of food, but all customers had chosen to eat outside. Alex looked out through the door and caught his breath. Yasen had got up and was walking purposely toward him. Had he spotted? But then he saw Yasen was holding something, a mobile phone. He must have received a call and was coming into the restaurant to take it privately. Another few steps and he would reach the door. Alex looked around him and saw an alcove screened by a bead curtain. He pushed through it and found himself in a storage area just big enough to conceal himself. Mops, buckets, cardboard boxes, and empty wine bottles crowded around him. The beads shivered and became still. Yasen was suddenly there. "I arrived 20 minutes ago," he was saying. He was speaking English with only a very slight trace of a Russian accent. "Franco was waiting for me. The address he confirmed and everything had been arranged." There was a pause. Alex tried not to breathe. He was centimeters away from Yasen, separated only by the fragile barrier of brightly coloured beads. But for the fact that it was so dark inside at the glare of the sun, Yasen would surely have seen him. "We'll do it this afternoon. You have nothing to worry about. It's better for us to communicate. I'll report to you on my return to England." Yasen Gregorovich clicked off the phone and suddenly became quite still. Alex actually saw the moment, the sudden alertness as some animal instinct told Yasen that he had been overheard. The phone was still cradled inside the man's hands, but it could have been a knife he was about to throw. His head was still, but his eyes glancing from side to side, searching for the enemy. Alex stayed where he was, behind the beats, not daring to move. What should he do? He was tempted to make a break for it, to run out into the open air. No, he would be dead before he had taken 2 steps. Yes, they would kill him before he even knew who he was or why he had been there. Very slowly, Alex looked around for a weapon, for anything to defend himself, and then the kitchen door swung open and a waiter came out, swerving round Yasen and calling to someone at the same time. The stillness of the moment was shattered. Yasen slipped the phone into his trouser pocket and went out to rejoin the other men. Alex let out a huge sigh of relief. What had he learnt? Yasen Grigorievich had come here to kill someone. He was sure of that much. The address is confirmed and everything has been arranged. But at least Alex hadn't heard his own name mentioned, so he was right. The target was probably some Frenchman living here in St. Pierre. It had happened this afternoon. A gunshot, or perhaps a knife flashing in the sun. A fleeting moment of violence, and someone somewhere would sit back knowing they had one enemy less. What could he do? And he pushed through the bead curtains and made his way out of the back of the restaurant. He was relieved to find himself in the street, away from the square. Only now did he try to collect his thoughts. He could go to the police, of course. He could tell them that he was a spy who had worked 3 times a day for MI6 British military intelligence. He could say that he had recognized Yasen knew him for what he was, and that a killing would almost certainly take place that afternoon unless he was stopped. What good would it do? The French police might understand him, but they would never believe him. He was a 14-year-old English schoolboy with sand in his hair and a suntan. They would take one look at him and laugh. He could go to Sabina and her parents, but Alex didn't want to do that either. He was only here because they had invited him. And why should he bring murder into their holiday? Not that they would believe him any more than the police. Once where he had been staying with her in Cornwall, Alex had tried to tell Sabina the truth. She had thought he was joking. Alex looked around at the tourist shops, the ice cream parlours, with the crowd strolling happily along the streets. It was a typical picture postcard view, the real world. So what the hell was he doing, getting mixed up again with spies and assassins? He was on holiday. This was none of his business. Let Yasen do whatever he wanted. Alex wouldn't be able to stop him even if he tried. Better to forget that he had ever seen him. Alex took a deep breath and walked back down the road towards the beach to find Sabina and her parents. As he went, he tried to work out what he would tell them. Why he had left so suddenly, and why he was no longer smiling now that he was back. That afternoon, Alex and Sabina hitched a lift with a local farmer to Aegis Mortis, a fortified town on the edge of the salt marshes. Sabina wanted to escape from her parents and hang out in a French cafe where they could watch the locals and tourists rub shoulders in the street. She had devised a system for marking French teenagers for good looks, with points lost for weedy legs, crooked teeth, or bad dress sense. Nobody had yet scored more than 7 out of 20. And Alex would normally have been happy sitting with her, listening to her as she laughed out loud, but not this afternoon. Everything was out of focus. The great walls and towers that surrounded him were miles away, and the sightseers seemed to be moving too slowly, like a film that had run down. Alex wanted to enjoy being here. He wanted to feel part of the holiday again, but seeing Yasen had spoilt it all. Alex had met Sabina only a month before when the two of them had been helping at the Wimbledon tennis tournament, but they had struck up an immediate friendship. Sabina was only a child. Her mother, Liz, worked as a fashion designer. Her father, Edward, was a journalist. Alex hadn't seen very much of him. He had started the holiday late, coming down on the train from Paris, and had been working on some story ever since. The family had rented a house just outside St. Pierre, right on the edge of the river. The Petit Road was a simple place, typical of the area, bright white with blue shutters and a roof of baked terracotta tiles. There were 3 bedrooms and on the ground floor an airy of old-fashioned kitchen that opened onto an overgrown garden with a swimming pool and a tennis court with weeds pushing through the asphalt. Alex had loved it from the start. His bedrooms overlooked the river, and every evening he and Sabina had spent hours sprawling over an old wicker sofa, talking quietly and watching the water ripple past. The first week of the holiday had disappeared in a flash. They had swum in the pool and in the sea, which was less than a mile away. They had gone walking, climbing, canoeing, and once it was Alex's favourite sport, horse riding. Alex really liked Sabina's parents. They were sort of adults who hadn't forgotten that they had once been teenagers themselves, and more or less left him and Sabina to do whatever they wanted on their own. And for the last 7 days, everything had been fine. Until Yasen. We had the rest is confirmed and everything had been arranged. We'll do it this afternoon. What was the Russian planning to do in St. Pierre? What bad luck! What was it that had brought him here, casting his shadow once again over Alex's life, despite the heat of the afternoon sun? Alex shivered. Alex? He really said Sabina had been talking to him and looked round. She was gazing across the table. What are you thinking? What are you thinking about? She asked. You're miles away. Nothing. You hadn't been yourself all afternoon. Did something happen this morning? Where did you disappear to on the beach? I told you I just needed a drink. He hated her having to lie to her, but he couldn't tell her the truth. I was just saying we ought to get going. I promised we'd be home by 5. Oh my God, look at that one. She pointed at another teenager walking past. 4 out of 20. Aren't there any good-looking boys in France? She glanced at Alex. Apart from you, I mean. So how many do I get out of 20, Alex asked. 12 and a half, she said, at last. Don't worry, Alex. Another 10 years and you'll be perfect. Sometimes horror announces itself in the smallest of ways. On this day, it was a single police car racing along the wide empty road that twisted down to St. Pierre. Alex and Sabina were sitting in the back of the same truck that had brought them. They were looking at a herd of cows grazing in one of the fields when the police car, blue and white with light flashing on the roof, overtook them and tore off into the distance. Alex still had Yasen on his mind, and the sight of it tightened a knot in the pit of his stomach. But it was only a police car. It didn't have to mean anything. But then there was a helicopter taking off from somewhere not so far away and arsing into the brilliant sky. Sabina saw it and pointed at it. Something's happened, she said. That's just come from town. Had the helicopter come from town? Alex wasn't so sure. He watched it sweep over them and disappeared into the direction of Aegis Mortis, and all the time his breaths were getting shorter, and he felt the heavy weight of some nameless dread. And then they turned the corner, and Alex knew that his worst fears had come true, but in a way that he could never have foreseen. Rubble, jagged brickwork and twisted steel, thick black smoke curling into the sky. Their house had been blown apart. Just one wall remained intact, giving the cruel illusion that not too much damage had been done, but the rest of it was gone. Alex saw a brass bed hanging at a crazy angle, somehow suspended in midair. A pair of blue shutters lay in the grass about 50 meters away. The water in the swimming pool's brown and scummy. The blast must have been immense. A fleet of cars and vans was parked around the building. They belonged to the police, the hospital, the fire department, and the anti-terrorist squad. To Alex, they didn't look real, more like brightly coloured toys. In a foreign country, nothing looks more foreign than its emergency services. Mom! Dad! Alex heard Sabina shout the words and saw her leap out of the truck before they had stopped moving. Then she was running across the gravel drive, forcing her way between the officials in their different uniforms. The truck stopped and Alex climbed down, unsure whether his feet would come in contact with the ground or if he would simply go on right through it. His head was spinning. He thought he was going to faint. Nobody spoke to him as he continued forward. It was as if he wasn't there at all. Ahead of him, he saw Sabina's mother appear from nowhere, her face streaked with ashes and tears. And he thought to himself that if she was all right, if she had been out of the house where the explosion happened, then maybe Edward Pleasure had escaped too. But then he saw Sabina begin to shake and fall into her mother's arms, and he knew the worst. He drew near in time to hear Liz's words, and as she clutched hold of her daughter. We still don't know what happened. Dad had been taken by a helicopter to Montpellier. He's alive, Sabina, but he's badly injured. We're going to him now. You know your dad's a fighter, but the doctors aren't sure if he's going to make it or not. We just don't know. The smell of burning reached out to Alex and engulfed him. The smoke had blotted out the sun. His eyes began to water and he fought for a breath. This was his fault. He didn't know why it had happened, but he was utterly certain who was responsible. Yasin Gregorovich. None of my business. That was what Alex had thought. This was the result. Chapter 2. The finger on the trigger. The policeman facing Alex was young, inexperienced, and struggling to find the right words. It wasn't just that he was having difficulty with the English language. Alex realized down here, is this odd? Quiet corner of France. The worst he would usually have to deal with would be the occasional drunk driver, or maybe a tourist losing his wallet on the beach. This was a new situation, and he was completely out of his depth. It is the most terrible affair, he was saying. You have known Monsieur Pleasure for a very long time. No, not very long, I said. He will receive the best treatment. The policeman smiled encouragingly. Madame Pleasure and her daughter are going now to the hospital, but they have requested us to copy with us with you. Alex was sitting on a folding chair in the shadow of a tree. It was just after 5 o'clock, but the sun was still hot. The river flowed past a few meters away, and he would have given anything to dive into the water and keep swimming until he had put this whole business behind him. Sabina and her mother had left about 10 minutes ago, and now he was on his own with this young policeman. He had been given a chair in the shade and a bottle of water, but it was obvious nobody knew what to do with him. This wasn't his family. He had no right to be here. More officials had turned up. Senior policeman, senior fireman. They were moving slowly through the wreckage, occasionally turning over a plank or wood, or moving a piece of broken furniture, as if they might uncover the one simple clue that would tell them why this had taken place. We have telephoned to your consul, the policeman was saying. They will come to take you home, but they must send a representative from Lyon. It is a long way, so tonight you must wait here in St. Pierre. I know who did this, Alex said. Comment. I know who's responsible. Alex glanced in the direction of the house. You have to go into town. There was a yacht tied to the jetty. I didn't see the name, but you can't miss it. It's huge, white. There's a man on the yacht. His name is Yasen Gregorovich. You have to arrest him before he can get away. The policeman said, Alex was astonished. Alex wondered how much he had understood. I am sorry, what is it that you say? This man, Yasen Gregorovich? You know him? Yes? Yes. Who is he? He's a killer. He is paid to kill people. I saw him this morning. Please. The policeman held up a hand. He didn't want to listen to anymore. Wait here. Alex watched him walk away towards the parked cars, presumably to find a senior office. He took a sip of water and stood up himself. He didn't want to sit here watching the events from a folding chair like a picnicker. He walked towards the house. There was an evening breeze, but the smell of burnt wood still hung heavily all around. A scrap of paper scorched some black and blue across the gravel. On an impulse, Alex reached down and picked it up. He read, Caviar for breakfast and the swimming pool at his Wiltshire mansion is rumoured to have been built in the shape of Elvis Presley. But Damien Crazy is more than the world's richest, most successful pop star. His business ventures, including hotels, TV stations and computer games, have added millions more to his personal fortune. The questions remain. Why was Cray in Paris earlier this week? And why did he arrange a secret meeting with... That was all he said. The rest of them has been burnt off. That was all that was all there was. The paper turned black and the words disappeared. Alex realized what he was looking at. It must be a page from the article that Edward Pleasure had been working on ever since he had arrived at the house. Something to do with mega celebrity Damien Cray. Excusez-moi. Je ne remets. He looked up and saw that the policeman had turned and returned with a second man. This one, a few years older, with a downturned mouth and a small moustache. He recognized the type before. The man had spoken oily and self-important, and wearing a uniform that was too neat. There was a disbelief etched all over his face. You have something to tell us? He asked. He spoke better English than his colleague. I repeated what he had said. How do you know this man on the boat? Or this man, the man on the boat? He killed my uncle. Who was your uncle? He was a spy. He worked for MI6. I took a deep breath. I think I may have been the target of a bomb. The thing was trying to kill me. The two policemen spoke briefly together, then turned back to Alex. Alex knew what was coming. The senior policeman had rearranged his features so that he now looked down at Alex with a mixture of kindness and concern. But there was an arrogance. There too. I am right. You are wrong, and nothing will persuade me otherwise. You're like a bad teacher in a bad school, putting a cross beside a right answer. You have a terrible shock, the policeman said. The explosion was already known. We already know that it was caused by a leak in the gas pipe. No, Alex shook his head. The policeman held up a hand. There is no reason why an assassin would wish to harm our family on holiday. But I understand you are upset. It is quite possible that you are in shock. You do not know what it is you are saying. Please, we have sent for someone from your consulator, and he will arrive soon. Until then, it would be better if you did not interfere. Alex hung his head. Do you mind if I go for a walk? He said. The words came out low and muffled. A walk? Just 5 minutes. I want to be my own. Of course, do not go too far. Would you like someone to accompany you? No, I'll be all right. He turned and walked away. He avoided meeting the policeman's eyes. and they doubtless thought he was ashamed of himself. That was right. That was all right. I still want them to see his fury, the black anger that coursed through him like an Arctic river. They had believed him. They had treated him like a stupid child. With every strategic images stamped themselves on his mind. Sabina's eyes widened as she took in the wreck of a house. Edward pleasure of being flown to some city hospital in Horowitz on the deck of the yacht, gliding off into the sunset. Another job done, and it was Alex's fault. That was the worst of it. There was the unforgivable part. Well, he wasn't going to sit there and take it. Alex allowed his rage to carry him forward. It was time to take control. When he reached the main door, he glanced back. The policeman had forgotten him. He took one last look at the burnt-out shell that had been his holiday home, and the darkness rose up in him again. He turned away and began to run. St. Pierre was just under a mile away. It was early evening by the time he had arrived there, and the streets were packed with people in a festive mood. In fact, the town seemed busier than ever. Then he remembered. There was a bullfight tonight, and people had driven in from all around to watch it. The sun was dipping a bit behind the horizon, but daylight still lingered in the air as if accidentally left behind. The street lamps were lit, throwing garish pools of orange onto the sandy pavements. An old carousel turned round and round, and a spinning blur of electric bulbs and jangling music. Alex made his way through it all. Without stopping, suddenly he was on the other side of town, and the streets were quiet again. The night had advanced, and everything was a little more grey. He hadn't expected to see the yacht. At the back of his mind, he had thought that Yassen would have left long ago, but there it was, moored where he had seen it earlier that day, a lifetime ago. There was nobody in sight. It seemed that the whole town had gone to the bullfight. Then a figure stepped out of the darkness, and Alex saw the bald man with a sunburn. He was still dressed in the white suit. He was smoking a cigar, the smouldering tip casting a red glow across his face. There were lights glinting behind the portholes of the boat. Would he find Yassen behind one of them? Alex had no real idea what he was doing. Anger was still driving him blindly on, and he knew what that was that he had to get onto the arch, and that nothing was going to stop him. The man's name was Franco. He had stepped down onto the jetty because Yassen hated the smell of cigar smoke. He didn't like Yassen more than that. He was afraid of him. When the Russian had heard that Edward Pleasure had been injured, not killed, he had said nothing. But there had been something intense and ugly in his eyes. For a moment he had looked at Raoul, the deckhand. It had been Raoul who had actually placed the bomb too far from the journalist's room. As it turned out, the mistake was his, and Franco knew that Yassen had very nearly killed him, and then perhaps he still would. God, what a mess! Franco heard the shoe scraping against loose rubber and saw a boy walking towards him. He was slim and suntanned, wearing shorts and a faded t-shirt with a string of wooden beads around his neck. He had fair hair which hung in strands over his forehead. He must be a tourist. He looked English, but what was he doing here? Alex had wondered how close he could get to the man before his suspicions were aroused. If it had been an adult approaching the boat, it would have been a different matter. And the fact that he was only 14 was the main reason he had been so useful to M86. People didn't notice him until it was too late. That was what happened now. As the boy came closer, Franco was struck by the dark brown eyes set in a face that was somehow too serious for a boy of that age. They were eyes that had seen too much. Alex drew level with Franco. At the moment he lashed out, spinning round on the ball of his left foot, kicking with the right. Franco was taken by surprise. Alex's heel struck him hard in the stomach, But straight away Alex knew that he had underestimated his opponent. He had expected to feel the soft fat beneath the strapping suit, but his foot had slammed into a ring of muscle. And although Franco was hurt and winded, he hadn't been brought down. Franco dropped the cigar and lunged, his hand away, scrambling into his jacket pocket. It came out holding something. There was a soft click and 7 inches of glinting silver leaped out of nowhere. He had a flick knife, moving much faster than Alex would have thought possible. He launched himself across the jetty. His hand swung in an arc. Alex heard the blade slice in the air. He swung again and the knife flashed past Alex's face, missing him by a centimetre. Alex was unharmed. Alex had obviously used the knife many times before, and if he hadn't been weakened by the first kick, this fight would already have been over. Alex looked around, searching for anything he could defend himself with. There was almost nothing on the jetty, just a few old boxes, a bucket, and a fisherman's net. Franco was moving more slowly now. He was fighting a kid, nothing more. The little brat might have been surprised him with that first attack, but it would be easy enough to bring this to an end. He muttered a few words in French, something low and ugly. Then a second later, his fist swung through the air, this time carrying the knife in an upward arc that would have cut Alex's throat in an upward arc that would have cut his throat if he hadn't thrown himself backwards. Alex cried out. He had lost his footing, falling heavily onto his back, one arm outstretched. Franco grinned slowly, showing 2 gold teeth, and stepped towards him, anxious to finish this off. Too late he saw that he had been trickled. Alex's hand had caught the hold of the net, and as Franco loomed over him, he sprang up, swinging his arm forward with all his strength. The net spread out, falling over Franco's head, shoulder, and knife hand. He swore and twisted round, trying to free himself, but the movement only entangled him all the more. Alex knew he had to finish this quickly. Franco was still struggling with the net, but Alex saw him open his mouth to call for help. They were right next to the yacht. If Yassen had heard anything, there'd be nothing more Alex could do. He took aim and kicked the man a second time, driving into the man's stomach. The breath was knocked out of him. Alex saw his face turn red. He was half out of the net, performing a bizarre dance on the edge of the jetty when he lost his balance and fell with his hand trapped. He couldn't protect himself. His head hit the concrete with a loud crack and he lay still. Alex stood breathing heavily. In the distance he heard a trumpet blare and there was a scattered round of applause. The bullfight was due to begin in 10 minutes. A small band had arrived and was about to play. Alex looked at the unconscious man, knowing he had a close escape. There was no sign of the knife. Maybe he had fallen into water. Briefly, he wondered if he should go on. Then he thought of Sabina and her father. The next thing he knew, he had climbed the gangplank and was standing on the deck. The boat was called Ferdinand. Alex noticed the name as he climbed up, and he remembered seeing it somewhere else. That was it. It was on a school trip to London Zoo. It was some sort of snake, poisonous of course. He was standing in a wide area with a steering wheel and controls next to a door on one side, leather sofas across the back. There was a low table. The bold man must have been sitting here before he went down for a smoke. Alex saw a crumbled magazine, a bottle of beer, a mobile phone and a gun. He recognised the telephone. It was Yassen's. He had seen it in the Russian's hand back at the restaurant earlier that day. The phone was an odd colour, a shade of brown. Alex might have ignored it, but now he noticed that the screen was still illuminated. He picked it up quickly. Alex quickly scrolled to the call register. He found what he was looking for, a record of all the calls Yassen had received that day. 12:15 he had been talking to a number that began 44207. The 44 was England. The 207 meant it was somewhere in London. That was the call Alex had overheard in the restaurant. Quickly he memorized the number. It was the number of the person who had given Yassen his orders. It would tell him all he needed to know. He picked up the gun. He finally had it. Each time he had worked for MI6, he had asked them to give him a gun, and each time they had refused, but they had supplied him with gadgets, bony tranquilizer darts, stun grenades, smoke bombs, nothing that would kill. I felt the power of the weapon he was holding. He weighed it in his hand. The gun was a Gratch MP 443 black with a short muzzle and ribbed sock. It was a Russian, of course. New army issue. He allowed his finger to curl around the trigger and smiled grimly. Now he and Yasen were equals. He padded forward, went through the door and climbed down a short flight of stairs, then went below deck and into a corridor that seemed to run the length of a boat with cabins on either side. He had seen a lounge above, but he knew that it was empty. There had been no lights behind those windows. If Yasen was anywhere, he would be down here, clutching the grass more tightly. He crept along his feet, making no sound on the thickly carpeted floor. He came to a door and saw a yellow strip of light seeping out of the crack below. Gritting his teeth, he reached for the handle, half hoping it would be locked. The handle turned on it, and the door opened. Alex went in. The cabin was a surprisingly large and long rectangle with a white carpet and modern wooden fittings along two of the walls. The third wall was taken up by a low double bed with a table and a lamp on each side. There was a man stretched out on the white corner, his eyes closed, as still as a corpse. Alex stepped forward. There was no sound in the room, but in the distance he could hear the band playing at the bullring, 2 or 3 trumpets, a tuba and a drum. Yasen Horowitz made no movement as Alex approached, the gun held out in front of him. Alex reached the side of the bed. This was the closest he had ever been to the Russian man who had killed his uncle. You could see every detail of his face. The chiseled lips, the almost feminine eyelashes. The gun was only a centimetre away from Yasen's forehead. This was where it all ended. All he had to do, pull the trigger and it would be over. Good evening, Alex. It wasn't that Yasen had woken up. His eyes had been closed and now they weren't. It was as simple as that. His face hadn't changed. He knew who Alex was immediately, at the same time talking in the gun that was pointed at him, taking it in and accepting it. Alex said nothing. There was a slight tremble in the hand holding the gun, and he brought his other hand up to steady it. You have my gun, Yasen said. Alex took a breath. Do you intend to use it? Nothing, Yasen continued calmly. I think you should consider very carefully. Killing a man is more like you see on television. If you pull that trigger, you'll fire a real bullet into real flesh and blood. I will feel nothing. I will be dead instantly. You will live with what you have done for the rest of your life. You'll never forget it. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Do you really have it in you, Alex? Can you make your finger obey you? Can you kill me? Alex was a statue. All his concentration was focused on the finger curled around the trigger. It was simple. There was a spring mechanism. The trigger would pull back the hammer and release it. The hammer would strike the bullet, a piece of death, just 19 millimeters long, sending it in on its short, fast journey to the man's head. He could do it. Maybe you have forgotten what I once told you. This isn't your life. It has nothing to do with you. Yasen was totally relaxed. There was no emotion in his voice. He seemed to have known Alex better than Alex knew himself. Alex tried to look away, to find the void, the calm blue eyes that were watching him. It's some little pity. Why did he do it? Alex wondered. You blew up the house. Why? The eyes flickered briefly. Because I was paid. Paid to kill me? No, Alex. For a moment, Yasen sounded almost amused. It had nothing to do with you. Then who? But it was too late. He saw it in Yasen's eyes first that he knew the Russian had been keeping him distracted as the cabin door opened and quietly beneath him. A pair of hands seized him and he swung violently away from the bed. He saw Yasen whip aside, as fast as a snake, as fast as a third and the lance. The gun went off, but Alex hadn't fired it intentionally, and the bullet smashed into the floor. He hit a wall and felt the gun drop out of his hand. He could see the taste in his blood. The yacht seemed to be swaying. In the far distance, a fanfare sounded, followed by an echoing roar from the crowd. The bullfight had begun. But everybody, that would be the end of me reading you my first episode of Alex Rider of book 4. So bye bye everyone, and thank you for listening to this book.